My name is Melissa Judd, and on behalf of everyone at Vector, thank you for spending this time with us today, and in particular, what feels like the first day of spring, at least here in Toronto. I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking our funders, the Province of Ontario, the Government of Canada through the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy administered by CFAR, and industry sponsors from across the Canadian economy. I also wanted to pause and acknowledge the land on which Vector is located in Toronto, what is now a meeting place for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, as well as newcomers to Canada from around the globe. The land we are situated on is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We are grateful to be hosted on this land. I would now like to introduce the co-founders of Phase AI, who will be delivering today's webinar, and say a little bit about each of them because they've been on some pretty interesting paths themselves that are worth learning a little bit more about. Wojciech Gryk is an AI researcher and data scientist who has researched and built AI-driven products at organizations such as McKinsey, IBM, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University. He also founded and sold a customer analytics startup focused on data integration and ML automation. Wojciech has MSc degrees in mathematical modeling and the social science of the internet from the University of Oxford, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. Joining him is Andrea Yip, who is a scientist, designer, and researcher. Her career has focused on product design and research in clinical settings, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace, and she has worked with organizations such as Johnson & Johnson, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and RBC. Andrea has a Master of Public Health from the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming them here today.
Melissa, thank you so much for welcoming us. We're very glad and excited to be here for this second webinar. My name is Wojciech. This is Andrea. She'll be joining us for the Q&A when we conclude the actual presentation part of today. So Andrea, thank you for being here.
Thanks. See you soon.
So as Melissa mentioned, today we're going to be discussing the nuances of data roles and hybrid career trajectories. This is the second webinar in our series of 3. The first focused on accelerating your career via your online presence. And this one really focuses on how to pick the right roles that you should be applying for to make sure that you can actually have the most successful applications, the most positive and beneficial experiences, both for yourself and for your potential employers. We started the last webinar with a conversation about DataCo, which is a company that we worked with. Obviously, the name was a little different in real life, but a company that we worked with several months ago to help fill a few roles. And DataCo specifically wanted to build out a machine learning team, and they were looking to fill 4 roles. And one of the things that really surprised us at the time, although it's a trend that has been taking place for a while, is how many applicants we actually saw within this process. So they were looking for ML researchers, a team lead, data engineer, data scientist. They had 6,000 applicants apply for these roles. The other thing that really surprised us was about 1,000 people applied for 2 or more roles. And the roles were different, I can assure you that much. And so it really taught us a lot about how people perceive some of these opportunities and how they choose to apply for things. And as a side note, we also see employers struggling with role definitions quite a bit as well, which is one of the reasons why today's session is so important to us. Now, of those 6,000 applicants, only about 100 went through phone screens where a recruiter or hiring manager was able to hop on a call with them. I mean, just from the numbers alone, it's impossible to actually have a conversation with most of these people. And when you really think about it, we can only spend a few seconds per applicant at most when we have 6,000 of them to go through. After the phone screen, we had about 10 final interviews, so 10 out of 6,000. And we made 6 offers. The reason we made 6 for 4 roles is that, well, 2 folks decided to go somewhere else or realized that the fit wasn't maybe the right one for them with this company. So 6,000 applicants through to 6 offers. Those numbers can seem intimidating, they can seem painful, they can seem scary. And that's one of the things that we really are excited to be working with the Vector Institute on, is to help people actually manage this process. As I mentioned, the first webinar focused on why are you great? How do you actually present your online self, your resume, LinkedIn portfolio to stand out from those 6,000 applicants to get on the phone and have a phone screen? Today, we'll be talking about why are you great for this role? And when I say this role, of course, you could apply to dozens of jobs. Sometimes we meet people who apply for hundreds of jobs, via one-click applications on sites like LinkedIn, and they wonder why they're not getting responses or phone calls back. And that's one of the things we really want to address today, is how do you pick the right role for yourself that you should be applying for next, but also how do you build out your broader career path, so you're not just picking the role that you might be offered or the role that gets back to you first, but rather you can strategically think about where you want to be and how the different roles that you'll have over the next 5, 10, 15 years actually enable you to get there. At the next webinar, we will be talking about why are you the best fit? So if you do get into the interview process more formally, how do you actually succeed at the interview process? What does that look like? What are the tests that are typically applied, and how do you succeed at them? And as a side note, that will be on March 18th at 12 p.m. So hopefully you'll join us for that one as well. Now, in terms of why are you great for this role, there's really 4 broad questions that we'll be discussing today. The first is, what is my ideal job scenario? So what should I be applying for? But also, what kinds of jobs and situations and companies will I be most successful at? Not all of us are designed for the same type of job or same type of company. So how do we think intentionally about these things? The second question gets into the specifics of the data science job titles that we often see. And so what role will I be great at based on some of these strategic decisions I'll be making? Should I be a data scientist, a consultant, an ML engineer, an ML researcher, or maybe something else altogether? Thirdly, we'll be talking about hybrid data professionals. And again, for those of you, who have participated in some of the resume reviews, you'll notice that this is something that comes up a lot, is most data roles are actually hybrid roles, where you're not just doing pure data science, but you're actually applying that to a specific industry, business problems, client situations, and how do you actually merge those two so that you present yourself as best as possible and actually build that path for you. And lastly, where do I look? How do I actually apply for these roles and stand out, particularly in the scenarios around hybrid data professionals? So lots to cover today. And let's begin with, what is my ideal job scenario? So the big question here that we often encourage people to think about is, where do you want to be, and what are your strengths, and what are you good at? And there's a few axes that we really encourage people to explore when they're thinking about this. The first one, especially I think for the Vector Institute community as a whole, is this question around academia or industry. How academic do I want to stay in my role versus how applied or industry focused should I be? Do I like publishing papers? Do I like doing abstract theoretical research? Or do I get really, really excited when I'm actually solving problems for people that I can point to concretely and say, hey, that thing that I built or that thing that I solved, that was me, or that was part of a team that I was on, and that's really, really exciting. And of course, with all of these, this is a spectrum. So it's not a yes or no question. You could find roles that are in the middle, and we'll be talking about those as well. The second one is remote versus on-site. And remote versus on-site is something that comes up a lot, especially right now during COVID, but I would actually encourage you to think more broadly about this and more strategically, which is, sure, remote roles mean you're going to be on a webcam more often. You might not have many physical meetings, if any physical meetings at all. Maybe you'll have an annual retreat or quarterly retreat, versus on-site, you're obviously in the office every day or very often. But taking a step back beyond that, the skills and qualities that people have actually, and when they're successful in these roles, vary too. Some of the research that we've seen, for example, talks about remote individuals. People who are good at remote tend to be more introspective in nature. They tend to be writers and really good written communicators, because more of their presentations and follow-ups in meetings will be via the written word, Slack, email, proposals, memos, etc. On-site, people who are on-site tend to be more successful when they actually enjoy the physical presenting within meetings or networking or just dropping by people's desks. Neither is better nor worse, of course, but where you fall on that spectrum and how you think about your own roles is really, really important here. If you're really good at the written word and you enjoy being introspective, maybe on-site isn't right for you. Alternatively, maybe it is. The other angle to really think about here is startup versus corporate. And startup, I'll use interchangeably in this case with small or emerging business. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a venture-backed company that has 4 people growing to 400, but rather small versus big is another way to think about this. And the reason this is important is some people are very, very good at working in chaotic, ill-defined environments. And they enjoy the fact that maybe every day their role will change a little bit or might be unpredictable. Other people do really, really well in scenarios where everything is well defined and they have a very specific problem that they're working on, and people will leave them alone for a few days to focus on that without surprises or uncertainties. And that's another thing to think about here. And of course, as I mentioned, the spectrum, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's a 300-person company that is the ideal size for you, where it's mid-sized, there's some uncertainty, but not so much that you can't predict your day-to-day, but also has some more variety in the day-to-day work that you might be doing. And you can probably already start seeing how these aren't questions that you might answer on their own. You could, academic corporate, that's a research lab, for example, in a large company. Remote startup, we hear about those a lot. So can you imagine being that introspective thinker, but at the same time having some of that uncertainty? There's a really great paper that I recommend people read, and this will be shared. The links to this article will be shared at the end, which is by Peter Drucker, called "Managing Oneself." How do you actually think about managing yourself in these environments and actually inform your decision making? Practitioner versus manager is another angle to think about, and this is more probably for your second, third, fourth, etc. role. Practitioners are subject matter experts, technical experts. They like to solve the problem and they want to focus. Whereas a manager might be, in this case, a people manager, someone that maybe prefers to be a generalist, enjoys working with lots of people and coordinating resources, project plans, evangelizing the path to success rather than focusing on the technical expertise. That's a very common one, especially in combination with academia versus industry. And then the last two, just briefly, because I'll dive into them a bit later, is theoretical versus applied. Do you like doing the research, the theory, or actually solving very specific problems that are maybe less about abstracting and thinking about broader trends, but really just diving in and solving this for a specific customer or stakeholder? And internal versus external. What I mean by here is the idea of working on a very small, well-defined team where you work together as a unit, but really the problems are your own, or external, where you might be dealing with multiple business stakeholders, customers, clients, where you might literally have 7, 8 different people that you're coordinating with or around and trying to promote whatever it is you're doing to all of them. And I mentioned it's a spectrum. I mentioned it's something that you combine. And when we actually think about data science roles, here's a good example of that. Let's take applied versus theoretical, internal versus external. So what's an applied internal set of data science roles? Well, those might be analysts, data engineers, ML engineers, people that are solving very concrete, very specific problems, like how do I integrate these 3 data sets together efficiently and scalably? An analyst, where they might be analyzing one database for years in some cases and just trying to find as many different insights as possible. So very applied to the business, but internal. They might be working on their own for days, if not weeks at time, or certainly internal to a small team. Then you've got applied external. So these are people who are still working on one specific problem or set of problems, but they actually have external stakeholders. A solution engineer is a good example here, especially in contrast to a data engineer. A data engineer might be optimizing for the specific team that they're on. A solution engineer might be finding new customers or working with the sales team on a regular basis, where every time there's a new customer for your product, the solution engineer comes along and says, okay, we're going to take a month to actually show the customer how to do this integration, how to put it all together so that they can be successful with our product. But that means every month you're dealing with new external stakeholders. Data translator as opposed to analyst. This might be someone who does similar types of analyst work type projects and reporting, but actually presents to external stakeholders, executives, steering committees, depending on the type of company that they're working with. And data visualization experts are similar. Now you've got internal theoretical. So this could be someone like an ML researcher, where you are on the theoretical side, writing papers, applying research, but still working within your specific team, where you might be building the algorithm for the first time, but you're not worried about customers or other things like that. And another example here, but really straddling the border between theoretical and applied, is the AI team lead, where this might be a person who is working with the researchers, the data engineers, ML engineers to solve a problem, but really owns the specific team deliverables rather than worrying about external stakeholders as much. On the external theoretical side, ML product managers, data consultants, people who again have clients but are doing similar types of roles. And you'll notice we put data scientists right in the middle, because oftentimes we find that the actual data scientist role and title could actually mean any of these other roles and titles for people, but also actually varies quite a bit in terms of applied, theoretical, internal, external. And so this is probably confusing for you, and don't worry about that, or it could be overwhelming, certainly. I will say I get overwhelmed all the time. But one of the things I will say is it's also overwhelming for employers. And that's a really important piece for people starting their careers to think about, is your employer might also be struggling with this. And as an example that I'll give is ML researcher. We're talking about this being a theoretical internal role in our framework here. But I could see people arguing, well, no, that's actually a really applied role in my company. Or actually, our ML researchers are consultants or solution engineers. And so maybe they're more on the external side and maybe even more on the applied side. There's no right answer here. And the point is, this is how a lot of the recruiters, hiring managers, and other folks that you might be interacting with are actually dealing with this. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this in a few minutes, because one of the things that we often get as a question here is, well, how the heck do I know what sort of role I'm applying for if no one really has it all figured out? And don't worry, we'll be addressing that in a few minutes. Now, the other framework that I really like to bring up here as you think about the career path is in terms of internal ML roles and external ML roles, the different categories of work that people have. This is a screenshot from a paper on technical debt in machine learning systems that was published or written by a team of Google employees. And the point that they were trying to make in this paper is the fact that when it comes to machine learning roles, we often think about building deep learning models and computer vision or something like that with multi-layer neural networks. How cool is that? That's what everyone wants to work on, right? But actually, that in the middle here, this black box of ML code, it's actually a very small component of what most ML roles actually focus on. And being good at the configuration of models, data collection, verification, resource management, monitoring after you put these things into production, or feature extraction, where you might be developing features to put into the models, that's where like 90% of your time is actually spent in your specific roles or within your team. The staff might actually be split this way. And so again, thinking and understanding this is really important, especially because your employer is probably struggling with this as well, to be perfectly frank. And on the external ML role side of things, it's the same. You might be writing ML code or statistical queries or statistical models, but requirements gathering, consulting, integration and support, project management, really, really difficult. Communications and storytelling, for example, I would say are some of the hardest things to do when it comes to data and data science roles, because everyone who builds a model is so in the weeds on that model, and that model might be great, but how do you convince the 50 stakeholders you might actually have that this is the right thing to be doing, or that the conclusions of the model are correct or trustworthy or whatever else? And so very, very important to think about. Now, when it comes to this framework and this set of questions, again, we'll be thinking a little bit about what are the roles that make sense for you based on all of this. I will just encourage you again to think, it's not about having one framework that's the right framework. You can see Google has one approach. We're talking about 7 different axes. Really, the thing I encourage people to do here is to think intentionally about where you want to be and what you want to be applying for. Now, I'll just stop here for a few questions that have come up. And one of the ones that comes up quite a bit here is how do you assess whether or not you're suited for a junior or senior role within these frameworks? And the other one that came up just briefly is the ML product manager role. Why does it fall on the theory side of the framework? So in terms of junior versus senior roles, I will say that within this framework, it's usually probably somewhere in the same bucket as just the titles that we're using, because usually you're going to still be doing similar types of work. So if the company defines, let's say, the data scientist as an internal role that's very applied, that's probably true for junior data scientists and senior data scientists as well. Where things start maybe changing a little bit is as you become more and more senior, that practitioner versus people manager axis, becomes really important, because usually people do at a certain point have to make a decision in terms of how they will focus their own career development. Do they want to be a people leader, people manager, or do they want to become more and more nuanced and niche in terms of their expertise? Both are fantastic career paths, but once you start working on the people management side of things, you might not have time to keep up with the latest and greatest research. At the same time, if you are keeping up with the latest and greatest research, you might not have the time to dedicate to one-on-ones, project management, process management, all of which is really, really important. On the product management side of things, I'm going to come back to this a bit later as well, because we'll be talking about that role in a lot more detail. But I will say it is one of the ones that right off the bat, it's a very vague role for a lot of people, and every company is a little different. So again, take what we're saying here with the framing that it's not that we're saying this is the right answer and it's the only way, but this is one way to think about it. Now, from that perspective, that's a good segue into talking about the various types of roles. So, as you think about your process and career progression, you might have a hypothesis around where you think you're going to fit in or what works well for you. And one thing I will say, by the way, is it's not necessarily the case that you're going to pick an axis and say, I'm going to be academic, internal, theoretical, and that's where you're stuck for the rest of your life, for better or for worse. But rather, it's also a way where, as you think about internships or early career roles, you might actually just want to explore multiple angles here. One of the things I recommend, for example, when people are starting their careers is try working for a startup, try working for a large corporate, and try working for a company in the middle. How did you feel? What did you prefer? Because now at least you know, and that'll save you a lot of time and energy later, potentially. So when it comes to actually deciding what sorts of roles you want to have, the question comes up: should I be an analyst, a scientist, an engineer when it comes to data? Should I be an ML researcher? Should I be something else? And again, lots of roles as we've certainly explored. And what we want to do here is walk you through how to read a job description to really understand the nuances of the roles themselves, and why, even though the title might be the same across companies, the actual work is going to be vastly different. And one of the things that we've done to really help make this process a little less overwhelming is we have 3 profiles that we've created that are a little theoretical in nature, where we'll show you how we might actually advise Jorge, Shona, and Mina in terms of their own applications for these roles. So first and foremost, here are the roles that we think about in terms of the traditional data science roles. Don't worry about writing all of this down. It's going to be in a PDF later. But and then I certainly won't. Don't worry, I won't go through all of these cells for the next 45 minutes. But basically, we think about analysts, we think about data scientists, ML researchers, data engineers, ML engineers, team leads, and consultants. And in terms of the technical skills, they do vary across the board. One other thing that I often encourage people to think about here are the non-technical skills. Analysts have to be good at communication, data visualization, data cleaning, and documentation, again, for a lot of those internal roles. A data consultant, on the other hand, needs to really focus on research translation, client management, as opposed to maybe the internal work that an analyst would do. Data engineers also have to communicate well. So do ML engineers, mainly because they have to explain why the heck is the company investing in all this infrastructure when the ML code is the thing that's supposed to be good. Remember that Google diagram, right? ML researchers need to be good at translating the research from papers or presentations given by other researchers into actual applied work that might be done by the company. And of course, there's also different specializations here to think about. Analysts might focus on marketing, on sales, whereas ML researchers might get more and more technical and nuanced with NLP or computer vision. So I encourage you to revisit this table when it's shared after the presentation, so that if you're thinking about specific roles or trying to compare and contrast them, this is one way to do so. Now, we're going to actually dive into 3 of these based on job postings. And these are all job postings that we found online that are publicly available and looking for candidates right now or recently. And we just wanted to emphasize the differences between them. So let's start with the data analyst. So Point Click Care is looking for a data analyst. They're talking about someone who has industry knowledge and has work experience with electronic health records and product leaders in EHR. They specifically say this is a new position. So that means they might still be figuring out some of the details, right? And Point Click Care is on the scale of small, mid-sized, or large companies, they're probably somewhere in the middle. They're also looking for someone who has experience in life sciences and long-term post-acute care. So very clearly, they are looking for some sort of a subject matter expert. Yes, they want you to analyze data, but it would be really great if you understood their business and the industry that they're in. Ada, on the other hand, is looking also for a subject matter expert to answer internal and external stakeholders' questions. They're looking for someone who has clear verbal and written communication skills. And you'll notice that it talks about synthesizing data that can guide business product strategies. So very focused on the product, very focused on a mix of internal and external stakeholders. And one thing that's really interesting here is they don't say that you're specifically working on one problem the whole time or one area of expertise the whole time. It's the product, it's the business, and you'll have different stakeholders. So this feels almost like an internal consulting role. Communitech, you're going to be reporting to the VP. You again have internal stakeholders and business analysts. This is a cross-functional role. In a similar way, Communitech, Ada, very similar types of job descriptions in many ways. You're going to be talking with multiple stakeholders. Your day-to-day work will probably be similar, but month to month or quarter to quarter, it might be different because depending on the business strategy and the business needs, you might be working on different projects or different questions need to be answered, or you might have different stakeholders and clients internally. With Point Click Care, it sounds like everything will be focused on healthcare and on long-term post-acute care. Great, now you know, right? And so you could already see here how you might want to frame yourself. And you'll notice too, I'm not focusing on the specific requirements of the role where they might talk about Python or SQL or whatever else. Those are things that you can interpret and think about in terms of whether you fit the criteria. And if you have questions about that, of course, happy to answer them later in the presentation. But really what I want to emphasize here is the job description, how people describe your day-to-day work is actually really important. And oftentimes most people they skip these paragraphs and go straight to the requirements instead. So let's meet Jorge. Jorge has a bachelor's degree in computer engineering, master's in management of AI, has some teaching assistant experience and wants to be working in fintech and aspires to be a senior analyst. So if I were meeting with Jorge right here, I would say, obviously Point Click Care doesn't sound like a great opportunity if it's a healthcare company. Again, might be a great opportunity for many other people, but Jorge's career aspirations are a little different. On the flip side, Communitech and maybe even Ada sound like a really good fit for him. And so let's say he chooses Communitech because he'll be working with the VPs. He'll also be working in a pretty interesting company, frankly, in terms of some of the projects that they work on. So how should he frame himself here? I mean, sure, he should mention that he has the requirements that are listed in the job requirements section. But beyond that, what can he do to really emphasize some of these softer skills and some of these things that are maybe a little harder to define? One, I would really encourage him to emphasize end-to-end project work that he's done. It sounds like when he works with the VP at Communitech, he'll be working with someone that has specific questions and would probably love to delegate these questions and just hope that Jorge or whoever it is working in that role will be able to take them end to end, solve the stakeholders' problems, and do so fantastically. This means this role will require Jorge to communicate. So show your written communication skills, show your presentations. The other thing that I would say is really important here is, hey, the hiring manager, the person you will be reporting to, is listed in the job description, right? Maybe he should reach out to this person and say, here's why I'm great, here's my portfolio, I've done this sort of work before, I'm passionate about startups and fintech, etc. If you're interested in chatting, I'd love to chat. And more broadly, he might be a great role for other data analyst roles, or maybe even a data scientist role. I put in brackets here that he would maybe be great, particularly for a junior role, because his experience is focused so much on the analyst side of things. But nothing wrong with being aspirational. Speaking of data scientists, here's another set of roles specifically focusing on that. So Shift is a company that's looking for a data scientist, that you'll be part of their broader data science team, and you'll be working on rollouts for different solutions to clients. Okay, external role. You'll be working with clients. Later on, they actually say that you'll be working closely with the sales team for prospects and demoing. And you'll also be setting up and deploying code in production. Or pipelines anyway, sorry, in production. So external role, this actually feels like a solution engineer role. And I'm going to talk about that in the hybrid section, but very clearly, you're going to be solving specific problems. You're going to be working with clients. You're going to be working with the sales team as part of as part of your own team. So very different career path here, let's say, than maybe at Wish, where you'll be working cross-functionally as well. You'll still be a consultant. You'll be delivering against tight timelines and deadlines. But this is someone that looks like you might actually be optimizing for internal challenges at Wish specifically, because they're talking about feed optimization, supply strategies, evaluating and monitoring fraudulent behavior. That sounds like an internal set of activities. Yelp, as the probably largest difference compared to Shift, you're going to be part of a centralized team working in a collaborative environment. Great. So again, you're also part of a team, just like Shift. But on the other hand, you're going to be tracking Yelp's performance and informing product decisions. Okay, so what does this tell me? This tells me that while at Shift, you will have external stakeholders, you might be working with sales prospects and new customers. At Yelp, you're working with the product team. That's a team internal to Yelp. And so you'll be optimizing processes, helping them help run experiments. They're talking about designing, executing complex experiments, impacting millions of users. You're going to be communicating those insights. Now, those insights are going to be communicating to the product teams, right? Or the executives responsible for product. So very different set of people that you will be interacting with here. Also, probably a set of people that are more consistent over time. At Shift, maybe every quarter or every month, or maybe every week, you might have new customers coming in that you're building relationships with. At Yelp, you'll be dealing with a pretty consistent set of product people. So let's say you're Shona and you have a bachelor's degree in computer science, master's in computer science as well. You've started some student groups in data science, you've shown some leadership, and you've actually already worked as a data analyst. And you're seeking a product-oriented data science role. So the product-oriented piece here is critical. A lot of data scientists are happy being consultants. A lot of other data scientists are very happy working in product. Usually the two are very different, as you saw with Shift versus Yelp. So in this case, Shona sounds like she might be really interested in the Yelp role. And in her case, if that is the case and she chooses to apply, how should she frame herself? Well, Yelp talks a lot about running experiments and A/B tests across millions of users. So if Shona can in some way emphasize and show that she knows how to run experiments and design experiments and generate insights from those experiments, that's really powerful. This can be done in a portfolio setting or in blog posts, maybe where she analyzes publicly available product data. One of the things that's important here, though, for her and for Yelp, I imagine, is they will want to test her and on her ability to design experiments and make these conclusions. So she will want to show her rigorous experience in statistics, causality, predictive models, where she did take a data set and actually glean insights from them. And this is also really, really important because as we've actually run interviews for product-oriented teams like this, in those scenarios, people actually care a lot less about machine learning models and deep learning and things like that, even if they might frame the role that way. What they really care about is, can you make the right conclusions based on the experiments? Because nothing hurts a business more than running a poorly designed experiment, making a conclusion that doesn't actually apply to the business, and then productizing and scaling that. That is the risk that every business wants to avoid. So the sooner Shona can show that, the better. Really, really critical. And again, a portfolio here might be the perfect angle for her, or certainly a set of blog posts where she talks about this. So like not a portfolio with end-to-end projects, but a portfolio around experiment design could be very, very powerful here. Okay, and now let's talk about machine learning scientist or researcher. So again, same type of approach, 3 different roles. You've got Chisel AI, tactical, not theoretical, we've highlighted. You're reporting to product development manager. So again, you've got the hiring manager here. You could reach out to them, right? You're writing production ready code. Okay, all of that is very important. I'm going to jump straight to the Facebook one here. I encourage you to explore all 3 of these, but on the Facebook side of things, you're joining a research organization, a part of a team of recognized experts producing new science. This is really critical to me, especially in contrast to what Chisel's looking for. Here you're producing new science, writing publications, helping with product development, communicating research versus writing production ready code. So you could already see here the vast difference in these roles. At Chisel, it sounds like you're actually maybe closer to a machine learning engineer than you are a machine learning researcher in some definitions. Certainly the Facebook role, very, very different. It doesn't sound like at Chisel you're going to be publishing papers. I'm not sure if you actually need a PhD. It says later you'll be working with data engineers. So it tells me this is a very applied role, even if it is an ML research role. On the Facebook side, it sounds like your job is going to be very much focusing on new research, less worried about production ready code, probably less worried about solving specific problems, let's say on the product side, but certainly communicating the research findings so that someone else can run with those insights and affect the product. So very, very different roles, very different career paths here too. If you're someone who wants to do a postdoc and maybe spend a few years in industry and then do a postdoc or go back to academia, Facebook probably is a great place because you can keep publishing and work on your portfolio. At Chisel, that might not be the case. At Chisel, maybe you're going to become that ML engineering expert where, again, fantastic career path where you can actually build production ready pipelines and code, but you won't be focusing on publishing. So your longer term career path will be different. So let's say you're Mina. And in Mina's case, again, computer engineering bachelor's, PhD in comp sci, ML consultant, and interested in a research role, maybe focused on computer vision. So you could see here, Mina is someone that might actually do well at Facebook, but frankly, could probably go across the board in some ways. However, actually, I will say one thing about that, just catch myself a little bit, which is people who are really good at the theoretical side of things, where they do algorithm design, research, publications, might oftentimes struggle with the productization of that research. And so if Mina decides to apply to Chisel, for example, if I were the hiring manager at Chisel anyway, I would probably really test her and dive into, can you code efficiently, can you code quickly, but is your code actually scalable? Does it meet our requirements? Facebook might care less about that because someone else would probably be doing that work. So if she is applying for these roles, what should she do? Emphasize her publications, maybe focus less on her portfolio, or treat her academic CV as the portfolio. So if she has a Google Scholar page, for example, or has published a few things where she's gotten a lot of citations, really, really good to emphasize that. If she's thinking about getting more applied, one of the things that I would actually encourage her to do is to take some of these theoretical papers that are published on the archive or at NeurIPS or some of these other conferences and write her own code implementing that to show people she can do that. And she can contribute those to open libraries like Hugging Face, let's say, or Spacey or some of the other tools, OpenCV maybe, just to show that, hey, I actually can take the research and apply it, and I've done so. You can check out some of my open source contributions to do so. And of course, in that case, being part of a GitHub repository that she's contributed to, or maybe having her own repository where she's done this and published it is really, really powerful. So again, I'll just stop here because I realize I've been covering a lot of ground, and so I'll see if there's any questions here. And so one of the questions that comes up is, for research-focused roles, what can people who maybe don't have a PhD do? This is a really, really good question, and it's one that actually thank you for asking it, whoever asked it, because I actually find for a lot of research roles, people get very demotivated because they think they need to have a PhD, and if they don't have one, that's the end. And that's actually not true. I've seen research labs hire people with undergrad backgrounds only. And there's two things that I highly recommend people do in this scenario. The first is show that you can think in a research-oriented way. So, because ultimately, it's not that you need a PhD. What does the PhD say? The PhD tells you that this is a person who's comfortable with research, can take abstract academic work and further it. But that's one way to show that, right? So maybe if you can do that in another setting, that's okay too. One of the people that I remember working with a long time ago with regards to this is actually someone who had an undergraduate degree and specifically was really interested in, at the time, a new and developing field, which was social network analysis. Working in a field where it's a new and developing field that not a lot of people focus on will essentially qualify you for research roles, even if you might not have a PhD, because maybe no one else can be found, number one. Or number two, maybe your research questions are so compelling that the research team wants to work with you. I've seen that happen many times. Today, natural language processing is a great place to be for this, especially because there are so many applied projects that struggle finding people who can take the theory and apply it. I also see few-shot learning, anomaly detection, really interesting spaces where you could actually do a lot of research openly and build relationships. The second thing I would say, though, is networking is critical here. The challenge when you apply via a recruiter or via a formal screening process in this context is that you might get filtered out or screened out very quickly by software, not by a person. And so in this case, what I would highly encourage you to do is try to connect with the hiring manager and show them your portfolio, show them that you have something very valuable that you can bring to the table. Because if there is literally an automated screen that's looking for PhDs and nothing else, you're going to get missed. But the hiring manager might veto the screening process decision-making. Now, the other piece that I'll quickly address just as one other question is around leveraging research publications when applying for industry roles. So this is also a really good question, because oftentimes what I do find is people who are very, very academic sometimes will struggle finding roles that are applied, or they'll find the roles, but they'll struggle getting the job because they're too theoretical, and people worry that they'll be stuck in that theoretical mindset rather than solving problems that are specific, to a client, a solution engineer, or whatever else. End-to-end projects, in short, that's what you should have if you can, is show that you can do the research, that you've published, great, you've done that. Walk me through a project that you've done end-to-end, where you've actually shipped code, shipped a product, or built something that is user-facing. Because what that tells me is that you can talk the theory, but you can also do the work to get to the final end deliverable. And finding people who can do both is so hard. So if you can do that, you will be getting a lot of interesting opportunities. So I'll talk about hybrid data professionals now. And this, as I mentioned, is a really interesting space, because most roles most data roles, believe it or not, are not pure data roles. You're going to be doing other things, or you need to be a subject matter expert, sort of like the point-click-care example, where you need to be in healthcare, or maybe on the Yelp side, where you need to be comfortable with product, and you need to be comfortable with really thinking both statistically rigorously, but also from the Yelp perspective. What does Yelp do, and how can we make it better, right? And so I'll start by just defining what we think or how we define hybrids. And in this case, this is someone who's either pivoting into data and AI from a non-data profession or might have non-traditional skill sets in some form. And so this could be people who moved from product into data science. I would even say pure software engineers moving into data science are already hybrids, because a lot of times software engineers really struggle thinking about statistics, machine learning, and things like that. People who have client management experience or international experience. One of the things that's come up in our resume reviews that breaks my heart a little bit is when people frame their experiences as a weakness, or they've been told to avoid their experiences because they might be perceived as a weakness. This often happens when you've worked in a space that has nothing to do with data, or you have so much international experience because you're new to Canada or something like that, that you might be a little embarrassed of that for some reason. And my advice to people is always, no, you really, really like emphasize it. If you frame it as a strength, sure, some people might disagree with you, and you know what, frankly, you shouldn't work there anyway. But the people that actually see that as a strength and agree with you, now you've got a champion at the company, both as you're applying for it, but more importantly, once you actually get hired, they will want you to succeed, and that's so powerful and that's so important. And so we'll go through 3 examples here of how people can do that. Before I do so, in a similar way, this table is going to be available in a PDF afterwards. But there are many types of hybrid data science roles. So this is by no means comprehensive. And you thought it was hard to define a data scientist. It's really hard to define hybrid roles because everyone is different. So remember that. And in this case, the 4 that I really like to think about, and really these are almost themes of hybrid roles, is architects, product managers, solution engineers, and translators. So a technical architect, this could be a data architect, it could be a solution architect, which is close to a solution engineer, so I'll talk about that later. It could be a technical architect that's doing not just data architecture, but broadly software design. The point with architecture, just like when it comes to buildings, an architect will design the strategy around the building, make sure that the whole story and vision of the building works, and then the engineers come and build it all. That's the same idea here, is a lot of companies really struggle not with having an engineer build all the individual pieces, but having someone oversee the whole thing so that they know what the principles are of the product, that those architectural principles and requirements align with the users themselves. That's a really hard role. And it requires a bit of a competing mindset, because you want to be technical enough to be on the engineer's side of things, but user focused enough that you can think about the end result not as an engineer, but as a person using the product or the solution, which is very difficult, very hard to find these people. ML data product managers, similar way. You need to talk to users, you need to understand their requirements, but then you need to translate those issues and problems that they're solving into specifications that a software engineer or an ML engineer or researcher can take and run with. And it's particularly difficult for ML because a lot of product managers have never worked in uncertain environments. A product manager in a non-ML role might say, hey, we need a user interface. It has to have a login screen. It has to respond within 100 milliseconds. And it has to do these 3 things once you log in. In ML, the really big problem is that you might say, hey, this algorithm will be wrong 10% of the time. How do we account for that? And we don't know which 10% it's going to be. So all of a sudden, it's not just taking requirements and saying build X and Y, and here are the stories in Jira or whatever you're using. It's also, how do we design the product when it will fail or make a mistake? Really, really difficult question. And this is another area, like I think in the next 10 years will be so active from both a research perspective and an application perspective. Solution engineers, similar to technical architects. The main difference that I would distinguish here is technical architects oftentimes are internal, so they're solving and building for the company. Solution engineers, as you saw with some of the job descriptions, you're working with the sales team and you're working with potential customers. So it's very focused on selling as much as it is on actually architecting a solution. And then translators, these are data science consultants, visualization experts, people that take this really technical, analytical reporting thing and convert it into something that a non-technical stakeholder will understand and appreciate and trust. And in a similar way, one thing about translators that I would say as a distinguishing role to product managers, a product manager has to do this with a product. You have to build trust with your user via the product. A translator has to build that same level of trust, but via reports, guidance, evangelism, so not via product necessarily. And so this is a good example, like to use the Yelp job posting. In that Yelp situation, let's say you're the translator or the data scientist that they've hired, and you find out that if you do X and Y, it'll double Yelp revenue. How do you actually convince the executive team that you're correct, or the product team? That's a really difficult question, especially if you did it via some really opaque machine learning algorithm that no one understands. So this is where the skills that are less technical, like the communication components, requirements gathering, project management, becomes so critical. And a lot of these roles, by the way, I would say I've certainly met, for every one of these roles, people who don't know how to code doing really, really well. Now, they need to understand how coding works, and they need to understand the challenges coders will face, or software engineers will face, but they don't have to do the coding themselves. So something to think about as well as you're potentially transitioning into these roles. So let's talk about a few profiles. So Jin has a bachelor's in computer science, MSc in analytics and AI, has 2 years of front-end software engineering experience. What should she be looking for, thinking about here? So obviously she wants to pivot into AI, in some form. I would actually say, so number one, she's a great example, and a lot of software engineers are, I would say, where she could be a solution engineer or focus on solution architecture, particularly within internal teams, if she hasn't actually done a lot of client-facing experience. One of the reasons that I like the front-end software engineering experience is that front-end developers oftentimes might have less experience with scaling databases or ML engineering, let's say, but what they do have is that translation layer. How do I build software that when a user logs in, they're not going to get upset and confused and never log in again, but rather, how do I actually make the interface welcoming? How do I communicate errors and bugs? How do I design with the user in mind, with empathy? That's really powerful. So solution engineer is a good one. Data architect might be a good one too, depending on her depth of engineering experience or what she worked on in the past. So Michael has a profile that also comes up a lot. And I mentioned people breaking my heart every once in a while. Here's a good example of that. So Michael has worked in 3 retail roles during undergrad. And I want to emphasize this, because we see this a lot. These are retail roles that have nothing to do with engineering or AI, but simply, in a customer-facing experience or role. He has mechanical engineering background, has some years of experience in product management as well, has taken courses in ML, but doesn't really code very well. He knows how to maybe write a script or two in SQL or Python, but certainly hasn't written production level code. So one of the things that comes up a lot in these scenarios is people try to hide their less technical experience or try to justify it. And why does this bug me so much? Because honestly, it's such a huge strength. We all need to work. We all have jobs, and we've all had jobs that we're proud of, or that were difficult, or that maybe weren't as compelling and maybe might not be aligned with our current career path. But those are still valuable experiences. And in this case, personally, as someone who's worked in e-commerce and analytics with e-commerce, the people who have had customer-facing retail roles are so cool, because they actually know what's on the ground and what's happening and how customers will respond. And so what often times I do in these scenarios is I tell Michael to actually frame it that way, because let's say you're working on that Yelp role, just hypothetically. A data scientist who's never had a role in retail or who understands how small businesses operate might have 3 or 4 interesting insights. Michael has credibility. He can say, yeah, those 3 insights are real or interesting, but this one, let me tell you what it was like when I was working as a cashier and what that was like. And this insight would have saved my butt hundreds of times. All of a sudden, he's just translated the insight into something with deep credibility, but you have to tell that story. So if you don't emphasize it that way, it's not going to work very well, because people will just assume, oh, that's whatever, I could ignore that part, right? The other example that comes up a lot here, especially for folks who have done startups, as an example, is if you started a company and put all this effort into it and it failed, you had to shut it down, you didn't raise funding or didn't find customers or whatever else. I'll tell you that every time I see someone who has that sort of story in their resume, I always interview them. And the reason I do that is, in a similar way, you know what the reality of the business is like. And sure, maybe you didn't learn how to be a better ML engineer or a researcher in that environment. But on the flip side, you know what it's like when the CEO is afraid or uncomfortable or might not hit his or her targets for sales. And when you can empathize with that, that is ridiculously powerful. So in a similar way, you could probably tell what I would recommend for Michael. Leverage that experience, really show it off, highlight that experience with technical communications. And again, this is a good place for a portfolio or a set of blog posts where there's a lot of interesting open source data sets on e-commerce, on retail, where he could actually analyze some of that data and say, here's what I've learned. And imagine a blog post. If he wrote a blog post that said, I had all of this front of house experience in stores, and here's what data scientists should know about that. I guarantee you that blog post will get him more interviews than anything else he might put on his resume. Well, I don't guarantee it, but I'm pretty certain of it. And then opportunities, data translator, team lead, specifically around product. And what's interesting here is if he frames all of this as that strength and actually becomes a team lead, again, doesn't have a lot of coding proficiency, but if he understands the reality of how coding works and the reality of how to deliver product, he would be a fantastic team lead. And last, but certainly not least, is Leona. So she's been working in public health, Master of Management Analytics, 8 years in health policy, some experience in AI, again, through coursework, but not actual industry experience. So you could probably tell someone like this might actually be a great fit for that point-click care example, right? She understands the AI in theory, and in practice, she knows the reality of healthcare. Really, really, really powerful combination. And the other piece that I'll often bring up here, because this comes up a lot in resumes, is government experience, public policy experience, international development experience, or even international development volunteering. These are all really difficult scenarios where you have to manage a lot of interesting, difficult, competing interests. So when you can come in and frame it that way, not say, hey, here's what I did, and hopefully that's okay, but I want to do AI, but rather come in and say, hey, public policy and healthcare is really difficult. You're dealing with stakeholders who don't trust each other, who are worried about their health, who don't know what the world's going to be like a year or two from now. And I know how that situation works. And I know how to take my learnings and apply them to AI. What a powerful story right off the bat. That's what you want to put in your about section for your resume or LinkedIn, for example. And I bet you a lot of health roles, they'll read that and be like, I want to interview this person. The rest, we'll worry about it later. And so in a similar way, opportunities, consultant, product manager, ML product manager in the context of our framework. And actually another one that I would bring up here for someone like Leona is sales. And the reason I bring up sales is that one other thing that's really, really hard to find is people who are comfortable selling data science, because most salespeople aren't very technical. So if you can come in and actually convince the customer or potential customer, the lead, that you can build a solution with the product you're selling, that goes so much further in a sales environment. So these are all interesting ways that you can pivot into data science without actually becoming an AI engineer, for example. So the last piece, I'll revisit questions at the end just to make sure we cover this, is where do you look? So all these cool roles, right? They're interesting, they're fascinating. Do they exist? How often do they exist? Where do I find them? And oftentimes when we talk to folks, when it comes to AI and ML, this is what they think about when they think about working in machine learning and data science. Is how do I work for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, or some iteration of the big companies at the time? And they, as you saw with some of our job descriptions, they certainly have very specific types of roles that they're offering. But this is where you might actually be one of 10,000 applicants for a role, or sometimes even more. And so it's very difficult to get into these companies. And at the same time, they might not be right for you, right? Maybe you've realized that you like the unstructured, chaotic environment of a startup combined with solution engineering in unpredictable environments where, that's probably not the things. So other areas that we often recommend people to look for, first is companies and organizations less known for their AI capabilities. So these are companies that might include pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, government, and defense, are all places where there's lots of data scientists that are hired, but a lot of people don't think of them as opportunities. And sometimes they even worry their careers might in some way stagnate if they go there. But I can tell you that working within these spaces and really emphasizing your background and you being intentional about your career progression, these are fantastic places to start. The other is focused geographies. Oftentimes people will talk about Toronto, Waterloo, or other tech hubs that are common or critical. But I can tell you, for example, when we work with companies in even smaller towns, quote unquote, like Ottawa. Ottawa is a big town, right? But it's even there, people struggle because they can't find as many talented individuals. And there's a lot more companies now comfortable with remote, but also there's a lot of companies in some of these cities and towns where they just don't get any applicants for their roles. And they're looking for really specific niche individuals who can actually go and solve problems. And alternatively, these companies will actually invest heavily in their development and their talent progression because they are so grateful to have good people working with them. Also, underrepresented teams within data and AI companies. This comes up a lot too. People analytics or HR analytics is a really interesting field right now. And it's one, for example, from a hybrid perspective, where you might have people who have HR experience or other experiences that don't typically lend themselves well to data science as we stereotypically think about it, where if they have analytics plus HR experience, they are the perfect people analytics person. Supply chain optimization is another example. And I'll end the presentation with just a few quick stories. This is a person that we worked with who we placed and who is a public testimonial for us, where Sagra wanted to work in data analytics, and her background was focused on toys and educational experiences for kids. And the reason I bring her up as a hybrid and a fantastic one at that is that she had the analytics experience. She also had a really interesting background in toys. And again, toys, when I'm thinking machine learning, I don't think toys, right? And there was a company we were working with that was a toy company, and they wanted to hire someone who is comfortable with analytics and understood the realities of building toys, selling toys, marketing toys. So they hired Sagra as the first person we introduced them to. And I say that because this is how excited they were to find someone who had this good balance, someone who understands analytics, but also understands the reality of this specific company. And that's something that is very, very common. And now you might say, well, I'm not always working with a recruiter or a community like Phase AI or something like that. And so the one piece that I recommend is if you think you're good for a hybrid role, tell your story. Watch webinar one more time, or revisit some of the recommendations we've made, where this is where framing your experiences in the unique way to you is so critical. Every role is a little different. So maybe that's a portfolio, maybe that's your LinkedIn, maybe it's both, maybe it's something else. The point is, you have to tell that story to the recruiter and the hiring manager rather than them figuring it out, because they won't have the time. They're dealing with 6,000 different applications as we went back at the start of the presentation. So you need to tell them the story. And the other piece is networking. A lot of hybrid roles are, again, people are applying, they have general experiences, but when you reach out to the hiring manager and say, hey, I'm perfect because of these 3 experiences, and here's my resume, I'd love to be considered for the role, that works wonders here. And a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, hiring managers have the ability to go around the screening process. So if you got auto filtered out because of a lack of something or in your resume, or a lack of keywords, but the hiring manager is like, this candidate, I want to interview them, you're going to get an interview. So that's the presentation. Thank you all for joining. I will definitely be taking a few questions. Before I do so, just one more time, I'll thank the Vector Institute for having us. Thank the Vector Institute sponsors for supporting this. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at hello@phaseai.com, as well as the Vector Institute itself at AImasters@vectorinstitute.ai. As a really, really brief reminder too, we will be sharing notes from this talk. So if you didn't take the notes or didn't scribble down the whole table, that's okay. Well, you'll also get a feedback survey. So if you could please fill that in, we would be absolutely grateful. And our next webinar will be on March 18th, 12 p.m. Eastern, focusing specifically on how to ace the actual interview. So you're going to use this presentation to get the interview. You're going to use the next presentation to get the job and accelerate your career. So thank you again, and I'll stop here just to take a few questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wojciech. That was great. Just before I dive into the questions, I do want to mention to folks as well that as we've been doing these resume reviews, we also have portfolio reviews, and we have a few spots available left. So if you are interested, we'd love to have you there. Reach out to AImasters@vectorinstitute.ai to reserve your spot right away. So there's not too many spots left, so please sign up. All right, so we do have a few minutes for some questions that we weren't able to get to in the presentation. And one of the things that came up in the questions is when it comes to roles and titles, there's a lot of, obviously you showed us examples where you can be a data scientist at different companies. They all entail a lot of different roles and responsibilities at the end of the day. How do you go about sort of searching for roles when you're really trying to dive into the responsibilities and the tasks, when those really matter? Is there a way to weed through different roles, look through job descriptions? Does it take other strategies, talking to folks? What would you recommend there?
Sure, great question. I would say, so as we were going through the presentation, one of the things that often comes up here is companies, I should say, spend a lot of time on the job description itself. And most people will simply jump to the requirements and they'll skip all of those juicy parts that we were highlighting for folks. And that's really important to review and explore and decide whether the actual day-to-day work will translate or align with your own career paths and ambitions. So that's something that you should definitely do. Most job boards do search across everything. So you could put in Python as a skill set, but you could also put in things like internal consultant or consultant to find those roles in the first place. The other thing that I will say is always remember that the interview is a two-way interview or the screening call or whatever. Yes, you want to be offered the next step in the process, but you also want to validate whether the job is for you. So the recruiter on the call or the talent acquisition specialist, the hiring manager, these are all people that if you ask them these questions, oh, this sounds like an internal consulting role, am I right? They will know and they will answer that because they also don't want you to apply for a role that doesn't actually fit what you're doing. So have those conversations. And thirdly, this is a good way to reach out if you haven't gotten the phone call, but you're really keen. If the hiring manager gets an email from you that says, hey, I'm actually really interested in this role. It sounds like, again, an internal consulting role. I think I'd be really good at that. Can you just confirm that that's the case? Right away, the hiring manager can answer that email with a quick yes or no, but you're already building a relationship and a very intentional one at that.
Awesome. And when it comes to, you mentioned in the hybrid section, you talked about a translator role, which feels quite unique as a title. I'm curious, can you comment a little bit about how you've seen sort of roles and titles within the data science AI field evolve? And, especially for the translator role in particular, are they advertised just as that, or are they sort of hidden within other titles and roles?
Sure. So definitely there's an evolution in role titles overall. 2 years ago, I think the idea of an ML engineer or a data engineer was less common, and everyone was just either a researcher or a data scientist or a software engineer. And so that evolution continues to happen. So also, and this is really important, yes, we have a framework here as we think about it, but the roles titles will change. And also different industries might have specific titles. The translator one is definitely unique, and we haven't seen it a lot as that title. This is where searching for the job description is really important. I don't remember which job posting it was now, but one of them did actually talk about translation in the job description, but the title I think was either data scientist or analyst. And so this is one of these things where you definitely need to look for the broader job description and find it there. The other piece is look at what the company does as a business. So Yelp is a good example. Yelp wants a data scientist. Of course, you're probably going to be working on product analytics because Yelp is a product-oriented company. If you're applying to Deloitte or BCG or McKinsey or something, well, those are consulting firms and they don't sell products. So there's a good chance there that it might be more on the translation side of things or the insight side of things. And so those are things that you might want to think about as you apply. But unfortunately, there's no easy way around this. As a lot of these roles, especially the hybrid ones, you're going to have to wade through that a little bit and even educate the recruiter or hiring manager why you might be right for the role when they maybe were coached that they're looking for a slightly different person for whatever reason.
Fair enough. We also got another question about what it might be like to be pursuing a PhD while working full-time at a company. How do those worlds sort of come together for different types of roles? How is that possible within an industry role to be able to pursue a PhD and do that at the same time?
I think it is. However, this is where choosing the right company, or on the various axes we were presenting, being intentional is important. Our example around Facebook, where you're working at an industrial research lab, obviously those folks are doing research, and in fact, you're working with people who could probably be really good mentors and guide you through your PhD. Now, what the company needs to do is A, be aware that you're doing that, and B, have the right work structure so that it enables you to do it. So the flip side of this, if I think back to even my startup days, having someone do part-time PhD would be really hard because we also just had an unpredictable day. So now what you don't want to do is have your PhD compete with the success of your company, or not your company, excuse me, but your role within the company. And so now you have to choose between being successful in one or the other, because then that'll just hurt you personally in some form. And being upfront with your managers, your team, that's something you're pursuing or want to pursue. It's very rare that I've met companies who are upset that they have ambitious employees, but they want to be involved in understanding what that might mean for them. And that's particularly true for your direct manager. Now, I will also say that certain roles lend themselves better for that. So ML researchers or ML engineers are a good example of that. If you're a consultant, especially if you're a consultant where you actually have to travel and meet clients, your role is going to be so different that doing at least a data-oriented PhD will probably be very difficult because there's not as much overlap. So those are things to watch out for.
Got it. And then just because we only have a couple or maybe just a minute left, wondering if you can just offer some advice around, if someone is looking at a particular type of job opportunity, how do you, and you actually have a chance to be in front of a recruiter or a hiring manager, how do you ask, or what kinds of questions do you think are important to ask about the role, just to get clarification? Do you find that there's certain questions that you find helpful just to get clarity around, is this consulting or is this something else? How will I fit in? What would you recommend there?
Sure. I think there's a few axes that are difficult to answer outside in. So for example, on the flip side, if you're applying to a big company or a startup, right? I mean, that you don't have to ask the recruiter. In fact, don't ask the recruiter because that means you don't know. And on the flip side, for something like an internal consulting or internal external role or theoretical versus applied, those are ones where you simply don't know until you show up in many cases, especially if the job description isn't clear. Those are the questions to ask the recruiter. So what I typically would look for here, and what I've seen people ask me as well, where I really appreciate the question is, am I expected to publish or can I publish? And this is particularly true with regards to the last question, where you might be doing a PhD or maybe want to return back to school one day. Who are the people I am presenting to? So you mentioned I have stakeholders and I need to present to them. Well, are these internal stakeholders or are they external? Some of the job descriptions we looked at did discuss that. Oh, you're dealing with customers, but not all of them. And so really clarifying that is important as well. The third thing that particularly for larger companies, that's sort of a broad question, but I think really important, is people who had this role before, where did they go next? And because what happens is if you're joining a data science team where everyone leaves to do a PhD, well, that's interesting. Versus if you join as a data scientist and everyone leaves to become a product manager or an actual consultant, well, that tells you a lot about who they were looking for and what works well or doesn't. So seeing where the career path was for other people, I think, is really important.
Perfect. Thank you so much for covering as many questions as I could fit in there. So really appreciate that, Wojciech.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.